Investigation of the tragedy story of how a drunk pilot killed 88 people in a terrible aviation disaster. Sometimes time stops at the most horrific moments, and September 14, 2008 became such a moment in the history of Russian aviation. At night, under simple weather conditions, a Boeing 737-500 of Aeroflot Nord, carrying 88 people on board, crashed while approaching Perm Airport. On September 14, 2008, just past midnight, Flight 821 taxied onto the runway at Sheremetyevo Airport. At the controls was 34-year-old Captain Rodion Medvedev. Rodion had only been flying Boeings for 2 years, but had already become a captain. His previous work on the Tu-134 gave him confidence, but the realities of modern air transport required a different experience. The first officer, 43-year-old Rustam Alaberdin, was also an experienced pilot, but had only 236 flight hours on Boeings, a critically low amount for the task ahead that night. Both pilots had just returned from vacation 3 days prior and were immediately thrust into a dense work schedule, automatically meaning a lack of rest. That night, behind the controls, was not only a fatigued pilot, but also one intoxicated by alcohol. This chain of events was a storm brewing, irresponsibility, and the relentless desire to mask fatigue at the cost of nearly 90 human lives. One of the passengers, an Englishwoman, managed to send a distressing SMS before departure.
"Darling, I'm very scared. It seems the pilot is drunk."
Other travelers, sensing the tension in the air, began to panic. Flight attendants tried to reassure everyone, insisting that everything was fine, but their own fears and the passengers' anxiety filled the dimly lit cabin. As the plane taxied onto the runway in Sheremetyevo, and the captain handed over control to the first officer, Rodion did not realize that danger lay ahead. It is important to understand that adding thrust before the plane is even aligned properly on the runway is not just a risk, it is playing with death. An unaligned aircraft on a slippery runway can lead to a skid, as had happened with other flights before. At 15:05, the Boeing lifted its nose and began its journey to Perm. At altitude, where mistakes become irreversible, the first officer attempted to program the onboard computer for landing, but struggling with English terminology, he was like a character lost in an unsolvable cosmic plot. Confusing miles with kilometers turned their usually effective teamwork into prolonged chaos. The crew, preoccupied with programming the flight computer, neglected the pre-landing briefing and failed to perform essential control checks. This was not just reckless, it was a complete breakdown of discipline. The captain, instead of maintaining oversight, assigned radio communications with air traffic control to the already overwhelmed first officer. What unfolded next was nothing short of an absurd tragedy. As the aircraft descended, the crew reported their altitude and approach procedure, attempted to adhere to air traffic control's instructions. However, in the dense fog, navigation became increasingly difficult. The controller's responses lacked clarity but carried an oddly confident tone. He simply reiterated the name of the approach procedure, leaving the first officer utterly confused about what was expected of him. Tension within the cockpit rose as the pilots fiercely debated the direction of their next turn. The captain was convinced they should turn left, while the first officer insisted on turning right. Their misunderstanding of the approach procedure diverted their attention, and the emotional strain escalated. Without realizing it, they began to lose control of the aircraft. Each of them looked to the other for reassurance, but none was found. In the midst of this turmoil, mismanagement of the autopilot modes led to an unexpected descent. The question, "How much are we descending?" became rhetorical. The response, 600 meters, Aeroflot 821 descending 600 meters, sounded increasingly uncertain. Every move felt chaotic. Emotions were running high, and control over the situation had slipped away. The captain failed to monitor the altimeter. The onboard computer, which could have assisted with calculations, failed to function correctly, and the information from air traffic control had no meaningful impact. The crew was disoriented, and the looming disaster was now almost inevitable. Lack of focus, a breakdown in command. The crisis reached its peak when the air traffic controller repeatedly asked the crew to set the airport's pressure reading 3 times. The captain, lost in his own thoughts, absent-mindedly confirmed compliance without realizing he had not actually completed the task. Under pressure, they neglected the importance of performing checklist procedures. The instincts honed through training now seemed completely useless. As pressure on flight management grew, Rodion decided to shift all responsibilities to the first officer. The situation became fatal when the first officer, uncertain of what was required of him, acted like a black box, where every mistake meant one less chance of survival for the passengers. It is terrifying to realize that they held the lives of so many people in their hands. In the final moments, as a result of uncontrolled flight behavior, the first officer desperately tried to counteract a left bank. Abandoning formalities, he struggled to correct the situation, but his actions only increased confusion and fear. Ultimately, his uncertainty led to a fatal mistake. As the aircraft reached extreme angles of uncertainty, the pilots plunged into the abyss of darkness. The captain, in a panic, abruptly pulled the control column to the left, a move that cost him dearly. In a disastrous error, the aircraft's movement spiraled out of control. What was once a steady flight turned into a horrifying, painfully slow descent. In the end, at an altitude where regaining control was no longer possible, the Boeing began executing maneuvers akin to extreme aerobatics before plunging into a deadly nosedive. The reckless movement, coupled with a lack of knowledge, inadequate training, and sheer panic at a critical moment, sealed the fate of everyone on board. At this stage, the situation is so critical that we must ask, what could have been done differently? How can pilot training be improved? Why do missed training lessons become fatal? And the most crucial question, who is responsible for the lost lives? The day after the disaster, Aeroflot announced that it was revoking Aeroflot Nord's right to use its brand. What began as a routine flight ended in tragedy. 5 passengers who missed the flight were provided transport back to Moscow's Yaroslavsky station. But no measure could bring back those who had already perished in this horrific tragedy. When discussing great tragedies, it is important to note that not only lives were lost, souls were shattered. The events of September 14, 2008 remain in history as a lesson that must leave an imprint on the minds of those who uphold safety regulations and see flight as a necessity. If we not only read about such tragedies, but fully